Chapter 7 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra, Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 7. How Mr. Winkle, instead of shooting at the pigeon and killing the crow, shot at the crow and wounded the pigeon. How the Dingley Dell Cricket Club played all Muggleton, and how all Muggleton dined at the Dingley Dell expense, with other interesting and instructive matters. The fatiguing adventures of the day, or the somniferous influence of the clergyman's tale, operated so strongly on the drowsy tendencies of Mr. Pickwick that in less than 5 minutes after he had been shown to his comfortable bedroom he fell into a sound and dreamless sleep, from which he was only awakened by the morning sun darting his bright beams reproachfully into the apartment. Mr. Pickwick was no sluggard, and he sprang like an ardent warrior from his tent bedstead. "Pleasant, pleasant country," sighed the enthusiastic gentleman as he opened his lattice window. Who could live to gaze from day to day on bricks and slates who had once felt the influence of a scene like this? Who could continue to exist where there are no cows but the cows on the chimney pots, nothing redolent of pan but pan tiles, no crop but stone crop? Who could bear to drag out a life in such a spot? Who, I ask, could endure it? And having cross-examined solitude after the most approved precedents, at considerable length, Mr. Pickwick thrust his head out of the lattice and looked around him. The rich, sweet smell of the hayricks rose to his chamber window. The 100 perfumes of the little flower garden beneath scented the air around. The deep green meadows shone in the morning dew that glistened on every leaf as it trembled in the gentle air, and the birds sang as if every sparkling drop were to them a fountain of inspiration. Mr. Pickwick fell into an enchanting and delicious reverie. "Hullo!" was the sound that roused him. He looked to the right, but he saw nobody. His eyes wandered to the left and pierced the prospect. He stared into the sky, but he wasn't wanted there, and then he did what a common mind would have done at once, looked into the garden, and there saw Mr. Wardle. "How are you?" said the good-humoured individual, out of breath with his own anticipations of pleasure. "Beautiful morning, ain't it? Glad to see you up so early. Make haste down and come out. I'll wait for you here." Mr. Pickwick needed no second invitation. 10 minutes sufficed for the completion of his toilet, and at the expiration of that time he was by the old gentleman's side. "Hullo!" said Mr. Pickwick in his turn, seeing that his companion was armed with a gun, and that another lay ready on the grass. "What's going forward?" "Why, your friend and I," replied the host, "are going out rook shooting before breakfast. He's a very good shot, ain't he?" "I've heard him say he's a capital one," replied Mr. Pickwick, "but I never saw him aim at anything." "Well," said the host, "I wish he'd come. Joe! Joe!" The fat boy, who, under the exciting influence of the morning, did not appear to be more than 3 parts and a fraction asleep, emerged from the house. "Go up and call the gentleman, and tell him he'll find me and Mr. Pickwick in the rookery. Show the gentleman the way there, d'ye hear?" The boy departed to execute his commission, and the host, carrying both guns like a second Robinson Crusoe, led the way from the garden. "This is the place," said the old gentleman, pausing after a few minutes' walking in an avenue of trees. The information was unnecessary, for the incessant cawing of the unconscious rooks sufficiently indicated their whereabouts. The old gentleman laid one gun on the ground and loaded the other. "Here they are," said Mr. Pickwick, and as he spoke the forms of Mr. Tupman, Mr. Snodgrass, and Mr. Winkle appeared in the distance. The fat boy, not being quite certain which gentleman he was directed to call, had, with peculiar sagacity, and to prevent the possibility of any mistake, called them all. "Come along!" shouted the old gentleman, addressing Mr. Winkle. "A keen hand like you ought to have been up long ago, even to such poor work as this." Mr. Winkle responded with a forced smile, and took up the spare gun with an expression of countenance which a metaphysical rook, impressed with a foreboding of his approaching death by violence, may be supposed to assume. It might have been keenness, but it looked remarkably like misery. The old gentleman nodded, and 2 ragged boys who had been marshalled to the spot under the direction of the infant Lambert forthwith commenced climbing up 2 of the trees. "What are these lads for?" inquired Mr. Pickwick abruptly. He was rather alarmed, for he was not quite certain but that the distress of the agricultural interest, about which he had often heard a great deal, might have compelled the small boys attached to the soil to earn a precarious and hazardous subsistence by making marks of themselves for inexperienced sportsmen. "Only to start the game," replied Mr. Wardle, laughing. "To what?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Why, in plain English, to frighten the rooks." "Oh, is that all?" "You are satisfied?" "Quite." "Very well. Shall I begin?" "If you please," said Mr. Winkle, glad of any respite. "Stand aside, then. Now for it." The boy shouted, and shook a branch with a nest on it. Half a dozen young rooks, in violent conversation, flew out to ask what the matter was. The old gentleman fired, by way of reply. Down fell one bird, and off flew the others. "Take him up, Joe," said the old gentleman. There was a smile upon the youth's face as he advanced. Indistinct visions of rook pie floated through his imagination. He laughed as he retired with the bird. It was a plump one. "Now, Mr. Winkle," said the host, reloading his own gun, "fire away." Mr. Winkle advanced and levelled his gun. Mr. Pickwick and his friends cowered involuntarily to escape damage from the heavy fall of rooks which they felt quite certain would be occasioned by the devastating barrel of their friend. There was a solemn pause, a shout, a flapping of wings, a faint click. "Hullo!" said the old gentleman. "Won't it go?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Missed fire," said Mr. Winkle, who was very pale, probably from disappointment. "Odd," said the old gentleman, taking the gun. "Never knew one of them miss fire before. Why, I don't see anything of the cap." "Bless my soul," said Mr. Winkle, "I declare I forgot the cap." The slight omission was rectified. Mr. Pickwick crouched again, Mr. Winkle stepped forward with an air of determination and resolution, and Mr. Tupman looked out from behind a tree. The boy shouted. 4 birds flew out. Mr. Winkle fired. There was a scream as of an individual, not a rook, in corporal anguish. Mr. Tupman had saved the lives of innumerable unoffending birds by receiving a portion of the charge in his left arm. To describe the confusion that ensued would be impossible. To tell how Mr. Pickwick, in the first transports of emotion, called Mr. Winkle "wretch," how Mr. Tupman lay prostrate on the ground, and how Mr. Winkle knelt horror-stricken beside him. How Mr. Tupman called distractedly upon some feminine Christian name, and then opened first one eye and then the other, and then fell back and shut them both, all this would be as difficult to describe in detail as it would be to depict the gradual recovering of the unfortunate individual, the binding up of his arm with pocket-handkerchiefs, and the conveying him back by slow degrees, supported by the arms of his anxious friends. They drew near the house. The ladies were at the garden gate waiting for their arrival and their breakfast. The spinster aunt appeared. She smiled and beckoned them to walk quicker. 'Twas evident she knew not of the disaster. Poor thing! There are times when ignorance is bliss indeed. They approached nearer. "Why, what is the matter with the little old gentleman?" said Isabella Wardle. The spinster aunt heeded not the remark. She thought it applied to Mr. Pickwick. In her eyes Tracy Tupman was a youth. She viewed his years through a diminishing glass. "Don't be frightened," called out the old host, fearful of alarming his daughters. The little party had crowded so completely round Mr. Tupman that they could not yet clearly discern the nature of the accident. "Don't be frightened," said the host. "What's the matter?" screamed the ladies. "Mr. Tupman has met with a little accident, that's all." The spinster aunt uttered a piercing scream, burst into an hysteric laugh, and fell backwards in the arms of her nieces. "Throw some cold water over her," said the old gentleman. "No, no," murmured the spinster aunt. "I am better now, Bella, Emily. A surgeon. Is he wounded? Is he dead? Is he? Ha, ha, ha!" Here the spinster aunt burst into fit number 2 of hysteric laughter interspersed with screams. "Calm yourself," said Mr. Tupman, affected almost to tears by this expression of sympathy with his sufferings. "Dear, dear madam, calm yourself." "It is his voice!" exclaimed the spinster aunt, and strong symptoms of fit number 3 developed themselves forthwith. "Do not agitate yourself, I entreat you, dearest madam," said Mr. Tupman soothingly. "I am very little hurt, I assure you." "Then you are not dead!" ejaculated the hysterical lady. "Oh, say you are not dead!" "Don't be a fool, Rachel," interposed Mr. Wardle, rather more roughly than was consistent with the poetic nature of the scene. "What the devil's the use of his saying he isn't dead?" "No, no, I am not," said Mr. Tupman. "I require no assistance but yours. Let me lean on your arm." He added in a whisper, "Oh, Miss Rachel!" The agitated female advanced and offered her arm. They turned into the breakfast parlour. Mr. Tracy Tupman gently pressed her hand to his lips and sank upon the sofa. "Are you faint?" inquired the anxious Rachel. "No," said Mr. Tupman, "it is nothing. I shall be better presently." He closed his eyes. "He sleeps," murmured the spinster aunt. His organs of vision had been closed nearly 20 seconds. "Dear, dear Mr. Tupman!" Mr. Tupman jumped up. "Oh, say those words again!" he exclaimed. The lady started. "Surely you did not hear them?" she said bashfully. "Oh, yes, I did," replied Mr. Tupman. "Repeat them, if you would have me recover. Repeat them." "Hush!" said the lady. "My brother." Mr. Tracy Tupman resumed his former position, and Mr. Wardle, accompanied by a surgeon, entered the room. The arm was examined, the wound dressed and pronounced to be a very slight one, and the minds of the company having been thus satisfied, they proceeded to satisfy their appetites with countenances to which an expression of cheerfulness was again restored. Mr. Pickwick alone was silent and reserved. Doubt and distrust were exhibited in his countenance. His confidence in Mr. Winkle had been shaken, greatly shaken, by the proceedings of the morning. "Are you a cricketer?" inquired Mr. Wardle of the marksman. At any other time Mr. Winkle would have replied in the affirmative. He felt the delicacy of his situation, and modestly replied, "No." "Are you, sir?" inquired Mr. Snodgrass. "I was once upon a time," replied the host, "but I have given it up now. I subscribe to the club here, but I don't play." "The grand match is played to day, I believe," said Mr. Pickwick. "It is," replied the host. "Of course you would like to see it?" "I, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick, "am delighted to view any sports which may be safely indulged in, and in which the impotent effects of unskilful people do not endanger human life." Mr. Pickwick paused and looked steadily on Mr. Winkle, who quailed beneath his leader's searching glance. The great man withdrew his eyes after a few minutes, and added, "Shall we be justified in leaving our wounded friend to the care of the ladies?" "You cannot leave me in better hands," said Mr. Tupman. "Quite impossible," said Mr. Snodgrass. It was therefore settled that Mr. Tupman should be left at home in charge of the females, and that the remainder of the guests, under the guidance of Mr. Wardle, should proceed to the spot where was to be held that trial of skill which had roused all Muggleton from its torpor, and inoculated Dingley Dell with a fever of excitement. As their walk, which was not above 2 miles long, lay through shady lanes and sequestered footpaths, and as their conversation turned upon the delightful scenery by which they were on every side surrounded, Mr. Pickwick was almost inclined to regret the expedition they had used when he found himself in the main street of the town of Muggleton. Everybody whose genius has a topographical bent knows perfectly well that Muggleton is a corporate town, with a mayor, burgesses, and freemen, and anybody who has consulted the addresses of the mayor to the freemen, or the freemen to the mayor, or both to the corporation, or all three to Parliament, will learn from thence what they ought to have known before, that Muggleton is an ancient and loyal borough, mingling a zealous advocacy of Christian principles with a devoted attachment to commercial rights, in demonstration whereof the mayor, corporation, and other inhabitants have presented at divers times no fewer than 1,420 petitions against the continuance of negro slavery abroad, and an equal number against any interference with the factory system at home, 68 in favor of the sale of livings in the church, and 86 for abolishing Sunday trading in the street. Mr. Pickwick stood in the principal street of this illustrious town, and gazed with an air of curiosity, not unmixed with interest, on the objects around him. There was an open square for the market place, and in the centre of it a large inn with a signpost in front, displaying an object very common in art, but rarely met with in nature, to wit, a blue lion with 3 bow legs in the air, balancing himself on the extreme point of the centre claw of his 4th foot. There were within sight an auctioneer's and fire agency office, a corn factor's, a linen draper's, a saddler's, a distiller's, a grocer's, and a shoe shop, the last mentioned warehouse being also appropriated to the diffusion of hats, bonnets, wearing apparel, cotton umbrellas, and useful knowledge. There was a red brick house with a small paved courtyard in front, which anybody might have known belonged to the attorney, and there was, moreover, another red brick house with Venetian blinds, and a large brass door plate, with a very legible announcement that it belonged to the surgeon. A few boys were making their way to the cricket field, and 2 or 3 shopkeepers who were standing at their doors looked as if they should like to be making their way to the same spot, as indeed to all appearance they might have done, without losing any great amount of custom thereby. Mr. Pickwick, having paused to make these observations, to be noted down at a more convenient period, hastened to rejoin his friends, who had turned out of the main street and were already within sight of the field of battle. The wickets were pitched, and so were a couple of marquees for the rest and refreshment of the contending parties. The game had not yet commenced. 2 or 3 Dingley Dellers and all Muggletonians were amusing themselves with a majestic air by throwing the ball carelessly from hand to hand, and several other gentlemen dressed like them, in straw hats, flannel jackets, and white trousers, a costume in which they looked very much like amateur stone masons, were sprinkled about the tents, towards one of which Mr. Wardle conducted the party. Several dozen of "How are you's" hailed the old gentleman's arrival, and a general raising of the straw hats and bending forward of the flannel jackets followed his introduction of his guests as gentlemen from London who were extremely anxious to witness the proceedings of the day, with which he had no doubt they would be greatly delighted. "You had better step into the marquee, I think, sir," said one very stout gentleman, whose body and legs looked like half a gigantic roll of flannel, elevated on a couple of inflated pillow-cases. "You'll find it much pleasanter, sir," urged another stout gentleman, who strongly resembled the other half of the roll of flannel aforesaid. "You're very good," said Mr. Pickwick. "This way," said the first speaker. "They notch in here. It's the best place in the whole field." And the cricketer, panting on before, preceded them to the tent. "Capital game! Smart sport! Fine exercise! Very!" were the words which fell upon Mr. Pickwick's ear as he entered the tent. And the first object that met his eyes was his green-coated friend of the Rochester coach, holding forth, to the no small delight and edification of a select circle of the chosen of all Muggleton. His dress was slightly improved, and he wore boots, but there was no mistaking him. The stranger recognized his friends immediately, and darting forward and seizing Mr. Pickwick by the hand, dragged him to a seat with his usual impetuosity, talking all the while as if the whole of the arrangements were under his especial patronage and direction. "This way, this way! Capital fun! Lots of beer, hogsheads, rounds of beef, bullocks, mustard, cartloads. Glorious day! Down with you! Make yourself at home! Glad to see you! Very!" Mr. Pickwick sat down as he was bid, and Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass also complied with the directions of their mysterious friend. Mr. Wardle looked on in silent wonder. "Mr. Wardle, a friend of mine," said Mr. Pickwick. "Friend of yours? My dear sir, how are you? Friend of my friends? Give me your hand, sir." And the stranger grasped Mr. Wardle's hand with all the fervour of a close intimacy of many years, and then stepped back a pace or two, as if to take a full survey of his face and figure, and then shook hands with him again, if possible, more warmly than before. "Well, and how came you here?" said Mr. Pickwick, with a smile in which benevolence struggled with surprise. "Come," replied the stranger. "Stopping at Crown at Muggleton. Met a party. Flannel jackets, white trousers, anchovy sandwiches, devilled kidney. Splendid fellows. Glorious." Mr. Pickwick was sufficiently versed in the stranger's system of stenography to infer from this rapid and disjointed communication that he had somehow or other contracted an acquaintance with the All Muggletons, which he had converted, by a process peculiar to himself, into that extent of good fellowship on which a general invitation may be easily founded. His curiosity was therefore satisfied, and putting on his spectacles he prepared himself to watch the play which was just commencing. All Muggleton had the first innings, and the interest became intense when Mr. Dumbkins and Mr. Potter, 2 of the most renowned members of that most distinguished club, walked bat in hand to their respective wickets. Mr. Luffy, the highest ornament of Dingley Dell, was pitched to bowl against the redoubtable Dumbkins, and Mr. Struggles was selected to do the same kind office for the hitherto unconquered Potter. Several players were stationed to "look out" in different parts of the field, and each fixed himself into the proper attitude by placing one hand on each knee and stooping very much as if he were "making a back" for some beginner at leap frog. All the regular players do this sort of thing. Indeed, it is generally supposed that it is quite impossible to look out properly in any other position. The umpires were stationed behind the wickets. The scorers were prepared to notch the runs. A breathless silence ensued. Mr. Luffy retired a few paces behind the wicket of the passive Potter, and applied the ball to his right eye for several seconds. Dumbkins confidently awaited its coming, with his eyes fixed on the motions of Luffy. "Play!" suddenly cried the bowler. The ball flew from his hand, straight and swift, towards the centre stump of the wicket. The wary Dumbkins was on the alert. It fell upon the tip of the bat, and bounded far away over the heads of the scouts, who had just stooped low enough to let it fly over them. "Run! Run! Another! Now then, throw her up! Up with her! Stop there! Another! No! Yes! No! Throw her up! Throw her up!" Such were the shouts which followed the stroke, and at the conclusion of which all Muggleton had scored 2. Nor was Potter behindhand in earning laurels wherewith to garnish himself and Muggleton. He blocked the doubtful balls, missed the bad ones, took the good ones, and sent them flying to all parts of the field. The scouts were hot and tired, the bowlers were changed and bowled till their arms ached, but Dumbkins and Potter remained unconquered. Did an elderly gentleman essay to stop the progress of the ball, it rolled between his legs or slipped between his fingers. Did a slim gentleman try to catch it, it struck him on the nose and bounded pleasantly off with redoubled violence, while the slim gentleman's eyes filled with water and his form writhed with anguish. Was it thrown straight up to the wicket, Dumbkins had reached it before the ball. In short, when Dumbkins was caught out and Potter stumped out, all Muggleton had notched some 54, while the score of the Dingley Dellers was as blank as their faces. The advantage was too great to be recovered. In vain did the eager Luffy and the enthusiastic Struggles do all that skill and experience could suggest to regain the ground Dingley Dell had lost in the contest. It was of no avail, and in an early period of the winning game Dingley Dell gave in and allowed the superior prowess of all Muggleton. The stranger, meanwhile, had been eating, drinking, and talking without cessation. At every good stroke he expressed his satisfaction and approval of the player in a most condescending and patronizing manner, which could not fail to have been highly gratifying to the party concerned, while at every bad attempt at a catch, and every failure to stop the ball, he launched his personal displeasure at the head of the devoted individual in such denunciations as "Ah! Ah! Stupid! Now, Butterfingers! Muff! Humbug!" and so forth, ejaculations which seemed to establish him in the opinion of all around as a most excellent and undeniable judge of the whole art and mystery of the noble game of cricket. "Capital game! Well played! Some strokes admirable!" said the stranger, as both sides crowded into the tent at the conclusion of the game. "You have played it, sir?" inquired Mr. Wardle, who had been much amused by his loquacity. "Played it? Think I have, thousands of times. Not here. West Indies. Exciting thing. Hot work, very." "It must be rather a warm pursuit in such a climate," observed Mr. Pickwick. "Warm? Red hot, scorching, glowing. Played a match once, single wicket. Friend the Colonel, Sir Thomas Blazo, who should get the greatest number of runs. Won the toss, first innings, 7 o'clock a.m. 6 natives to look out. Went in, kept in. Heat intense. Natives all fainted. Taken away. Fresh half-dozen ordered. Fainted also. Blazo bowling, supported by 2 natives. Couldn't bowl me out. Fainted 2. Cleared away the Colonel. Wouldn't give in. Faithful attendant. Quanko Samba. Last man left. Sun so hot, bat in blisters. Ball scorched brown. 570 runs. Rather exhausted. Quanko mustered up last remaining strength. Bowled me out. Had a bath, and went out to dinner." "And what became of what's his name, sir?" inquired the old gentleman. "Blazo? No, the other gentleman." "Quanko Samba?" "Yes, sir. Poor Quanko, never recovered it. Bowled on my account, bowled off on his own. Died, sir." Here the stranger buried his countenance in a brown jug, but whether to hide his emotion or imbibe its contents we cannot distinctly affirm. We only know that he paused suddenly, drew a long and deep breath, and looked anxiously on as two of the principal members of the Dingley Dell Club approached Mr. Pickwick and said, "We are about to partake of a plain dinner at the Blue Lion, sir. We hope you and your friends will join us." "Of course," said Mr. Wardle. "Among our friends we include Mr.—" and he looked towards the stranger. "Jingle," said that versatile gentleman, taking the hint at once. "Jingle, Alfred Jingle, Esquire, of No Hall Nowhere." "I shall be very happy, I am sure," said Mr. Pickwick. "So shall I," said Mr. Alfred Jingle, drawing one arm through Mr. Pickwick's and another through Mr. Wardle's, as he whispered confidentially in the ear of the former gentleman, "Devilish good dinner, cold but capital. Peeped into the room this morning. Fowls and pies and all that sort of thing. Pleasant fellows these, well behaved, too, very." There being no further preliminaries to arrange, the company straggled into the town in little knots of twos and threes, and within a quarter of an hour were all seated in the great room of the Blue Lion Inn, Muggleton, Mr. Dumbkins acting as chairman and Mr. Luffy officiating as vice. There was a vast deal of talking and rattling of knives and forks and plates, a great running about of three ponderous headed waiters, and a rapid disappearance of the substantial viands on the table, to each and every one of which item of confusion the facetious Mr. Jingle lent the aid of half a dozen ordinary men at least. When everybody had eaten as much as possible, the cloth was removed, bottles, glasses, and dessert were placed on the table, and the waiters withdrew to clear away, or, in other words, to appropriate to their own private use and emolument whatever remnants of the eatables and drinkables they could contrive to lay their hands on. Amidst the general hum of mirth and conversation that ensued, there was a little man with a puffy, "Say nothing to me or I'll contradict you" sort of countenance, who remained very quiet, occasionally looking round him when the conversation slackened, as if he contemplated putting in something very weighty, and now and then bursting into a short cough of inexpressible grandeur. At length, during a moment of comparative silence, the little man called out in a very loud, solemn voice, "Mr. Luffy!" Everybody was hushed into a profound stillness as the individual addressed replied, "Sir?" "I wish to address a few words to you, sir, if you will entreat the gentlemen to fill their glasses." Mr. Jingle uttered a patronizing "Hear, hear," which was responded to by the remainder of the company, and the glasses having been filled, the vice president assumed an air of wisdom in a state of profound attention, and said, "Mr. Staple." "Sir," said the little man, rising, "I wish to address what I have to say to you, and not to our worthy chairman, because our worthy chairman is in some measure, I may say in a great degree, the subject of what I have to say, or I may say to—" "State?" suggested Mr. Jingle. "Yes, to state," said the little man. "I thank my honourable friend, if he will allow me to call him so," 4 hears, and 1 certainly from Mr. Jingle, "for the suggestion. Sir, I am a Deller, a Dingley Deller." Cheers. "I cannot lay claim to the honour of forming an item in the population of Muggleton, nor, sir, I will frankly admit, do I covet that honour, and I will tell you why, sir. Hear! To Muggleton I will readily concede all these honours and distinctions, to which it can fairly lay claim. They are too numerous and too well known to require aid or recapitulation from me. But, sir, while we remember that Muggleton has given birth to a Dumbkins and a Potter, let us never forget that Dingley Dell can boast a Luffy and a Struggles. Vociferous cheering! Let me not be considered as wishing to detract from the merits of the former gentlemen. Sir, I envy them the luxury of their own feelings on this occasion. Cheers! Every gentleman who hears me is probably acquainted with the reply made by an individual who, to use an ordinary figure of speech, hung out in a tub to the Emperor Alexander. "If I were not Diogenes," said he, "I would be Alexander." I can well imagine these gentlemen to say, "If I were not Dumbkins, I would be Luffy. If I were not Potter, I would be Struggles." Enthusiasm! But, gentlemen of Muggleton, is it in cricket alone that your fellow townsmen stand pre-eminent? Have you never heard of Dumbkins and determination? Have you never been taught to associate Potter with property? Great applause! Have you never, when struggling for your rights, your liberties, and your privileges, been reduced, if only for an instant, to misgiving and despair? And when you have been thus depressed, has not the name of Dumbkins laid afresh within your breast the fire which had just gone out? And has not a word from that man lighted it again as brightly as if it had never expired? Great cheering! Gentlemen, I beg to surround with a rich halo of enthusiastic cheering the united names of Dumkins and Potter. Here the little man ceased, and here the company commenced a raising of voices and thumping of tables which lasted with little intermission during the remainder of the evening. Other toasts were drunk. Mr. Luffy and Mr. Struggles, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Jingle were, each in his turn, the subject of unqualified eulogium, and each in due course returned thanks for the honour. Enthusiastic as we are in the noble cause to which we have devoted ourselves, we should have felt a sensation of pride which we cannot express, and a consciousness of having done something to merit immortality of which we are now deprived, could we have laid the faintest outline on these addresses before our ardent readers. Mr. Snodgrass, as usual, took a great mass of notes, which would no doubt have afforded most useful and valuable information, had not the burning eloquence of the words, or the feverish influence of the wine, made that gentleman's hand so extremely unsteady as to render his writing nearly unintelligible, and his style wholly so. By dint of patient investigation, we have been enabled to trace some characters bearing a faint resemblance to the names of the speakers, and we can only discern an entry of a song, supposed to have been sung by Mr. Jingle, in which the words bowl, sparkling, ruby, bright, and wine are frequently repeated at short intervals. We fancy, too, that we can discern at the very end of the notes some indistinct reference to broiled bones, and then the words cold, without, occur, but as any hypothesis we could found upon them must necessarily rest upon mere conjecture, we are not disposed to indulge in any of the speculations to which they may give rise. We will therefore return to Mr. Tupman, merely adding that within some few minutes before 12 o'clock that night, the convocation of worthies of Dingley Dell and Muggleton were heard to sing, with great feeling and emphasis, the beautiful and pathetic national air of "We won't go home till morning, we won't go home till morning, we won't go home till morning, till daylight doth appear." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. Strongly illustrative of the position that the course of true love is not a railway. The quiet seclusion of Dingley Dell, the presence of so many of the gentler sex, and the solicitude and anxiety they evinced in his behalf, were all favourable to the growth and development of those softer feelings which nature had implanted deep in the bosom of Mr. Tracy Tupman, and which now appeared destined to centre in one lovely object. The young ladies were pretty, their manners winning, their dispositions unexceptionable; but there was a dignity in the air, a touch-me-nottishness in the walk, a majesty in the eye of the spinster aunt, to which, at their time of life, they could lay no claim, which distinguished her from any female on whom Mr. Tupman had ever gazed. That there was something kindred in their nature, something congenial in their souls, something mysteriously sympathetic in their bosoms, was evident. Her name was the first that rose to Mr. Tupman's lips as he lay wounded on the grass, and her hysteric laughter was the first sound that fell upon his ear when he was supported to the house. But had her agitation arisen from an amiable and feminine sensibility which would have been equally irrepressible in any case? Or had it been called forth by a more ardent and passionate feeling which he, of all men living, could alone awaken? These were the doubts which racked his brain as he lay extended on the sofa. These were the doubts which he determined should be at once and forever resolved. It was evening. Isabella and Emily had strolled out with Mr. Trundle. The deaf old lady had fallen asleep in her chair. The snoring of the fat boy penetrated in a low and monotonous sound from the distant kitchen. The buxom servants were lounging at the side door, enjoying the pleasantness of the hour and the delights of a flirtation on first principles with certain unwieldy animals attached to the farm. And there sat the interesting pair, uncared for by all, caring for none, and dreaming only of themselves. There they sat, in short, like a pair of carefully folded kid gloves bound up in each other. "I have forgotten my flowers," said the spinster aunt. "Water them now," said Mr. Tupman, in accents of persuasion. "You will take cold in the evening air," urged the spinster aunt affectionately. "No, no," said Mr. Tupman, rising. "It will do me good. Let me accompany you." The lady paused to adjust the sling in which the left arm of the youth was placed, and taking his right arm, led him to the garden. There was a bower at the farther end, with honeysuckle, jessamine, and creeping plants, one of those sweet retreats which humane men erect for the accommodation of spiders. The spinster aunt took up a large watering pot which lay in one corner, and was about to leave the arbor. Mr. Tupman detained her, and drew her to a seat beside him. "Miss Wardle," said he. The spinster aunt trembled, till some pebbles, which had accidentally found their way into the large watering pot, shook like an infant's rattle. "Miss Wardle," said Mr. Tupman, "you are an angel." "Mr. Tupman!" exclaimed Rachel, blushing as red as the watering pot itself. "Nay," said the eloquent Pickwickian, "I know it but too well." "All women are angels, they say," murmured the lady playfully. "Then what can you be, or to what, without presumption, can I compare you?" replied Mr. Tupman. "Where was the woman ever seen who resembled you? Where else could I hope to find so rare a combination of excellence and beauty? Where else could I seek to Oh!" Here Mr. Tupman paused, and pressed the hand which clasped the handle of the happy watering pot. The lady turned aside her head. "Men are such deceivers," she softly whispered. They are, ejaculated Mr. Tupman, "but not all men. There lives at least one being who can never change, one being who would be content to devote his whole existence to your happiness, who lives but in your eyes, who breathes but in your smiles, who bears the heavy burden of life itself only for you." "Could such an individual be found," said the lady. "But he can be found," said the ardent Mr. Tupman, interposing. "He is found. He is here, Miss Wardle." And ere the lady was aware of his intention, Mr. Tupman had sunk upon his knees at her feet. "Mr. Tupman, rise!" said Rachel. "Never!" was the valorous reply. "Oh, Rachel!" He seized her passive hand, and the watering pot fell to the ground as he pressed it to his lips. "Oh, Rachel, say you love me!" "Mr. Tupman," said the spinster aunt, with averted head, "I can hardly speak the words, but you are not wholly indifferent to me." Mr. Tupman no sooner heard this avowal than he proceeded to do what his enthusiastic emotions prompted, and what, for aught we know, for we are but little acquainted with such matters, people so circumstanced always do. He jumped up, and throwing his arm round the neck of the spinster aunt, imprinted upon her lips numerous kisses, which, after a due show of struggling and resistance, she received so passively that there is no telling how many more Mr. Tupman might have bestowed, if the lady had not given a very unaffected start, and exclaimed, in an affrighted tone, "Mr. Tupman, we are observed! We are discovered!" Mr. Tupman looked round. There was the fat boy, perfectly motionless, with his large circular eyes staring into the arbor, but without the slightest expression on his face that the most expert physiognomist could have referred to astonishment, curiosity, or any other known passion that agitates the human breast. Mr. Tupman gazed on the fat boy, and the fat boy stared at him, and the longer Mr. Tupman observed the utter vacancy of the fat boy's countenance, the more convinced he became that he either did not know, or did not understand, anything that had been going forward. Under this impression he said, with great firmness, "What do you want here, sir?" "Supper's ready, sir," was the prompt reply. "Have you just come here, sir?" inquired Mr. Tupman, with a piercing look. "Just," replied the fat boy. Mr. Tupman looked at him very hard again, but there was not a wink in his eye or a curve in his face. Mr. Tupman took the arm of the spinster aunt and walked towards the house. The fat boy followed behind. "He knows nothing of what has happened," he whispered. "Nothing," said the spinster aunt. There was a sound behind them, as of an imperfectly suppressed chuckle. Mr. Tupman turned sharply round. No, it could not have been the fat boy. There was not a gleam of mirth or anything but feeding in his whole visage. "He must have been fast asleep," whispered Mr. Tupman. "I have not the least doubt of it," replied the spinster aunt. They both laughed heartily. Mr. Tupman was wrong. The fat boy, for once, had not been fast asleep. He was awake, wide awake to what had been going forward. The supper passed off without any attempt at a general conversation. The old lady had gone to bed. Isabella Wardle devoted herself exclusively to Mr. Trundle. The spinster's attentions were reserved for Mr. Tupman, and Emily's thoughts appeared to be engrossed by some distant object. Possibly they were with the absent Snodgrass. 11, 12, 1 o'clock had struck, and the gentleman had not arrived. Consternation sat on every face. Could they have been waylaid and robbed? Should they send men and lanterns in every direction by which they could be supposed likely to have traveled home? Or should they— Hark! There they were. What could have made them so late? A strange voice, too. To whom could it belong? They rushed into the kitchen, whither the truants had repaired, and at once obtained rather more than a glimmering of the real state of the case. Mr. Pickwick, with his hands in his pockets and his hat cocked completely over his left eye, was leaning against the dresser, shaking his head from side to side, and producing a constant succession of the blandest and most benevolent smiles without being moved thereunto by any discernible cause or pretense whatsoever. Old Mr. Wardle, with a highly inflamed countenance, was grasping the hand of a strange gentleman, muttering protestations of eternal friendship. Mr. Winkle, supporting himself by the 8-day clock, was feebly invoking destruction upon the head of any member of the family who should suggest the propriety of his retiring for the night, and Mr. Snodgrass had sunk into a chair, with an expression of the most abject and hopeless misery that the human mind can imagine portrayed in every lineament of his expressive face. "Is anything the matter?" inquired the three ladies. "Nothing the matter," replied Mr. Pickwick. We're all right. I say, Wardle, we're all right, ain't we?" "I should think so," replied the jolly host. "My dears, here's my friend Mr. Jingle, Mr. Pickwick's friend. Mr. Jingle, come 'pon little visit." "Is anything the matter with Mr. Snodgrass, sir?" inquired Emily, with great anxiety. "Nothing the matter, ma'am," replied the stranger. "Cricket dinner, glorious party, capital songs, old port, claret, good, very good. Wine, ma'am, wine." "It wasn't the wine," murmured Mr. Snodgrass, in a broken voice. "It was the salmon. Somehow or other, it never is the wine in these cases." "Hadn't they better go to bed, ma'am?" inquired Emma. "Two of the boys will carry the gentleman upstairs." "I won't go to bed," said Mr. Winkle firmly. "No living boy shall carry me," said Mr. Pickwick stoutly, and he went on smiling as before. "Hurrah!" gasped Mr. Winkle faintly. "Hurrah!" echoed Mr. Pickwick, taking off his hat and dashing it on the floor, and insanely casting his spectacles into the middle of the kitchen. At this humorous feat he laughed outright. "Let's have 'nother bottle," cried Mr. Winkle, commencing in a very loud key and ending in a very faint one. His head dropped upon his breast, and muttering his invincible determination not to go to his bed, and a sanguinary regret that he had not "done for old Tupman" in the morning, he fell fast asleep, in which condition he was borne to his apartment by two young giants, under the personal superintendence of the fat boy, to whose protecting care Mr. Snodgrass shortly afterwards confided his own person. Mr. Pickwick accepted the proffered arm of Mr. Tupman and quietly disappeared, smiling more than ever; and Mr. Wardle, after taking as affectionate a leave of the whole family as if he were ordered for immediate execution, consigned to Mr. Trundle the honour of conveying him upstairs, and retired, with a very futile attempt to look impressively solemn and dignified. "What a shocking scene!" said the spinster aunt. "Disgusting!" ejaculated both the young ladies. "Dreadful! Dreadful!" said Jingle, looking very grave. He was about a bottle and a half ahead of any of his companions. "Horrid spectacle! Very!" "What a nice man!" whispered the spinster aunt to Mr. Tupman. "Good looking, too," whispered Emily Wardle. "Oh, decidedly," observed the spinster aunt. Mr. Tupman thought of the widow at Rochester, and his mind was troubled. The succeeding half hour's conversation was not of a nature to calm his perturbed spirit. The new visitor was very talkative, and the number of his anecdotes was only to be exceeded by the extent of his politeness. Mr. Tupman felt that as Jingle's popularity increased, he, Tupman, retired further into the shade. His laughter was forced, his merriment feigned, and when at last he laid his aching temples between the sheets, he thought, with horrid delight, on the satisfaction it would afford him to have Jingle's head at that moment between the feather bed and the mattress. The indefatigable stranger rose betimes next morning, and although his companions remained in bed overpowered with the dissipation of the previous night, exerted himself most successfully to promote the hilarity of the breakfast table. So successful were his efforts that even the deaf old lady insisted on having one or two of his best jokes retailed through the trumpet, and even she condescended to observe to the spinster aunt that he, meaning Jingle, was an impudent young fellow, a sentiment in which all her relations then and there present thoroughly coincided. It was the old lady's habit on the fine summer mornings to repair to the arbor in which Mr. Tupman had already signalized himself, in form and manner following. First, the fat boy fetched from a peg behind the old lady's bedroom door a close black satin bonnet, a warm cotton shawl, and a thick stick with a capacious handle; and the old lady, having put on the bonnet and shawl at her leisure, would lean one hand on the stick and the other on the fat boy's shoulder, and walk leisurely to the arbor, where the fat boy would leave her to enjoy the fresh air for the space of half an hour, at the expiration of which time he would return and reconduct her to the house. The old lady was very precise and very particular, and as this ceremony had been observed for 3 successive summers without the slightest deviation from the accustomed form, she was not a little surprised on this particular morning to see the fat boy, instead of leaving the arbor, walk a few paces out of it, look carefully round him in every direction, and return towards her with great stealth and an air of the most profound mystery. The old lady was timorous. Most old ladies are, and her first impression was that the bloated lad was about to do her some grievous bodily harm, with the view of possessing himself of her loose coin. She would have cried for assistance, but age and infirmity had long ago deprived her of the power of screaming. She therefore watched his motions with feelings of intense horror, which were in no degree diminished by his coming close up to her and shouting in her ear in an agitated and, as it seemed to her, a threatening tone, "Missus!" Now it so happened that Mr. Jingle was walking in the garden close to the arbor at that moment. He, too, heard the shouts of "Missus!" and stopped to hear more. There were 3 reasons for his doing so. In the first place, he was idle and curious. Secondly, he was by no means scrupulous. Thirdly, and lastly, he was concealed from view by some flowering shrubs. So there he stood, and there he listened. "Missus!" shouted the fat boy. "Well, Joe?" said the trembling old lady. "I'm sure I have been a good mistress to you, Joe. You have invariably been treated very kindly. You have never had too much to do, and you have always had enough to eat." This last was an appeal to the fat boy's most sensitive feelings. He seemed touched as he replied emphatically, "I knows I has." "Then what can you want to do now?" said the old lady, gaining courage. "I wants to make your flesh creep," replied the boy. This sounded like a very bloodthirsty mode of showing one's gratitude, and as the old lady did not precisely understand the process by which such a result was to be attained, all her former horrors returned. "What do you think I see in this very arbor last night?" inquired the boy. "Bless us, what?" exclaimed the old lady, alarmed at the solemn manner of the corpulent youth. "The strange gentleman, him as had his arm hurt, a kissin' and huggin'—" "Who, Joe? None of the servants, I hope?" "Worser than that," roared the fat boy in the old lady's ear. "Not one of my granddaughters?" "Worser than that." "Worse than that, Joe?" said the old lady, who had thought this the extreme limit of human atrocity. "Who was it, Joe? I insist upon knowing." The fat boy looked cautiously round, and having concluded his survey, shouted in the old lady's ear, "Miss Rachel!" "What?" said the old lady in a shrill tone. "Speak louder." "Miss Rachel!" roared the fat boy. "My daughter?" The train of nods which the fat boy gave by way of assent communicated a blancmange-like motion to his fat cheeks. "And she suffered him?" exclaimed the old lady. A grin stole over the fat boy's features as he said, "I see her a kissin' of him agin." If Mr. Jingle, from his place of concealment, could have beheld the expression which the old lady's face assumed at this communication, the probability is that a sudden burst of laughter would have betrayed his close vicinity to the summer house. He listened attentively. Fragments of angry sentences, such as "Without my permission? At her time of life? Miserable old 'oman like me? Might have waited till I was dead," and so forth, reached his ears. And then he heard the heels of the fat boy's boots crunching the gravel as he retired and left the old lady alone. It was a remarkable coincidence, perhaps, but it was nevertheless a fact, that Mr. Jingle, within 5 minutes of his arrival at Manor Farm on the preceding night, had inwardly resolved to lay siege to the heart of the spinster aunt without delay. He had observation enough to see that his off-hand manner was by no means disagreeable to the fair object of his attack, and he had more than a strong suspicion that she possessed that most desirable of all requisites, a small independence. The imperative necessity of ousting his rival by some means or other flashed quickly upon him, and he immediately resolved to adopt certain proceedings tending to that end and object without a moment's delay. Fielding tells us that man is fire and woman tow, and the Prince of Darkness sets a light to 'em. Mr. Jingle knew that young men to spinster aunts are as lighted gas to gunpowder, and he determined to essay the effect of an explosion without loss of time. Full of reflections upon this important decision, he crept from his place of concealment, and under cover of the shrubs before mentioned, approached the house. Fortune seemed determined to favour his design. Mr. Tupman and the rest of the gentlemen left the garden by the side gate just as he obtained a view of it, and the young ladies, he knew, had walked out alone soon after breakfast. The coast was clear. The breakfast parlour door was partially open. He peeped in. The spinster aunt was knitting. He coughed. She looked up and smiled. Hesitation formed no part of Mr. Alfred Jingle's character. He laid his finger on his lips mysteriously, walked in and closed the door. "Miss Wardle," said Mr. Jingle with affected earnestness, "forgive intrusion, short acquaintance, no time for ceremony, all discovered." "Sir," said the spinster aunt, rather astonished by the unexpected apparition and somewhat doubtful of Mr. Jingle's sanity. "Hush!" said Mr. Jingle in a stage whisper. "Large boy, dumpling face, round eyes, rascal." Here he shook his head expressively, and the spinster aunt trembled with agitation. "I presume you allude to Joseph, sir?" said the lady, making an effort to appear composed. "Yes, ma'am. Damn that Joe! Treacherous dog, Joe! Told the old lady. Old lady furious, wild, raving. Arbor, Tupman, kissing and hugging. All that sort of thing, eh, ma'am, eh?" "Mr. Jingle," said the spinster aunt, "if you come here, sir, to insult me—" "Not at all, by no means," replied the unabashed Mr. Jingle. "Overheard the tale. Came to warn you of your danger. Tender my services. Prevent the hubbub. Never mind. Think it an insult. Leave the room." And he turned as if to carry the threat into execution. "What shall I do?" said the poor spinster, bursting into tears. "My brother will be furious." "Of course he will," said Mr. Jingle, pausing. "Outrageous." "Oh, Mr. Jingle, what can I say?" exclaimed the spinster aunt, in another flood of despair. "Say he dreamt it," replied Mr. Jingle coolly. A ray of comfort darted across the mind of the spinster aunt at this suggestion. Mr. Jingle perceived it, and followed up his advantage. "Pooh, pooh! Nothing more easy. Blackguard boy, lovely woman, fat boy horsewhipped, you believed, end of the matter, all comfortable." Whether the probability of escaping from the consequences of this ill-timed discovery was delightful to the spinster's feelings, or whether the hearing herself described as a lovely woman softened the asperity of her grief, we know not. She blushed slightly and cast a grateful look on Mr. Jingle. That insinuating gentleman sighed deeply, fixed his eyes on the spinster aunt's face for a couple of minutes, started melodramatically, and suddenly withdrew them. "You seem unhappy, Mr. Jingle," said the lady in a plaintive voice. "May I show my gratitude for your kind interference by inquiring into the cause, with a view, if possible, to its removal?" "Ha!" exclaimed Mr. Jingle with another start. "Removal? Remove my unhappiness, and your love bestowed upon a man who is insensible to the blessing, who even now contemplates a design upon the affections of the niece of the creature, who But no, he is my friend. I will not expose his vices. Miss Wardle, farewell." At the conclusion of this address, the most consecutive he was ever known to utter, Mr. Jingle applied to his eyes the remnant of a handkerchief before noticed, and turned towards the door. "Stay, Mr. Jingle," said the spinster aunt emphatically. "You have made an allusion to Mr. Tupman. Explain it." "Never!" exclaimed Jingle, with a professional, i.e., theatrical air. "Never!" And by way of showing that he had no desire to be questioned further, he drew a chair close to that of the spinster aunt and sat down. "Mr. Jingle," said the aunt, "I entreat, I implore you, if there is any dreadful mystery connected with Mr. Tupman, reveal it." "Can I?" said Mr. Jingle, fixing his eyes on the aunt's face. "Can I see, lovely creature, sacrificed at the shrine, heartless avarice?" He appeared to be struggling with various conflicting emotions for a few seconds, and then said in a low voice, "Tupman only wants your money." "The wretch!" exclaimed the spinster with energetic indignation. Mr. Jingle's doubts were resolved. She had money. "More than that," said Jingle. "Loves another." "Another!" ejaculated the spinster. "Who?" "Short girl, black eyes, niece Emily." There was a pause. Now, if there was one individual in the whole world of whom the spinster aunt entertained a mortal and deep-rooted jealousy, it was this identical niece. The color rushed over her face and neck, and she tossed her head in silence with an air of ineffable contempt. At last, biting her thin lips and bridling up, she said, "It can't be. I won't believe it." "Watch him," said Jingle. "I will," said the aunt. "Watch his looks." "I will." "His whispers." "I will." "He'll sit next her at table." "Let him." "He'll flatter her." "Let him." "He'll pay her every possible attention." "Let him." "And he'll cut you." "Cut me!" screamed the spinster aunt. "He cut me, will he?" And she trembled with rage and disappointment. "You will convince yourself?" said Jingle. "I will." "You'll show your spirit?" "I will." "You'll not have him afterwards?" "Never." "You'll take somebody else?" "Yes." "You shall." Mr. Jingle fell on his knees, remained thereupon for 5 minutes thereafter, and Rose, the accepted lover of the spinster aunt, conditionally upon Mr. Tupman's perjury being made clear and manifest. The burden of proof lay with Mr. Alfred Jingle, and he produced his evidence that very day at dinner. The spinster aunt could hardly believe her eyes. Mr. Tracy Tupman was established at Emily's side, ogling, whispering, and smiling, in opposition to Mr. Snodgrass. Not a word, not a look, not a glance did he bestow upon his heart's pride of the evening before. "Damn that boy!" thought old Mr. Wardle to himself. He had heard the story from his mother. "Damn that boy! He must have been asleep. It's all imagination." "Traitor!" thought the spinster aunt. Dear Mr. Jingle was not deceiving me. Ugh! How I hate the wretch! The following conversation may serve to explain to our readers this apparently unaccountable alteration of deportment on the part of Mr. Tracy Tupman. The time was evening, the scene the garden. There were two figures walking in a side path. One was rather short and stout, the other tall and slim. They were Mr. Tupman and Mr. Jingle. The stout figure commenced the dialogue. "How did I do it?" he inquired. "Splendid! Capital! Couldn't act better myself. You must repeat the part to-morrow, every evening till further notice." "Does Rachel still wish it?" "Of course. She don't like it, but must be done. Avert suspicion. Afraid of her brother. Says there's no help for it. Only a few days more. When old folks blinded, crown your happiness." "Any message?" "Love. Best love, kindest regards, unalterable affection. Can I say anything for you?" "My dear fellow," replied the unsuspicious Mr. Tupman, fervently grasping his friend's hand, "carry my best love. Say how hard I find it to dissemble. Say anything that's kind. But add how sensible I am of the necessity of the suggestion she made to me, through you, this morning. Say I applaud her wisdom and admire her discretion." "I will. Anything more?" "Nothing. Only add how ardently I long for the time when I may call her mine, and all dissimulation may be unnecessary." "Certainly, certainly. Anything more?" "Oh, my friend," said poor Mr. Tupman, again grasping the hand of his companion, "receive my warmest thanks for your disinterested kindness, and forgive me if I have ever, even in thought, done you the injustice of supposing that you could stand in my way. My dear friend, can I ever repay you?" "Don't talk of it," replied Mr. Jingle. He stopped short, as if suddenly recollecting something, and said, "By the by, can't spare £10, can you? Very particular purpose. Pay you in 3 days." "I dare say I can," replied Mr. Tupman, in the fullness of his heart. "3 days, you say?" "Only 3 days. All over then. No more difficulties." Mr. Tupman counted the money into his companion's hand, and he dropped it piece by piece into his pocket as they walked towards the house. "Be careful," said Mr. Jingle. "Not a look." "Not a wink," said Mr. Tupman. "Not a syllable." "Not a whisper." "All your attentions to the niece. Rather rude than otherwise to the aunt. Only way of deceiving the old ones." "I'll take care," said Mr. Tupman aloud. "And I'll take care," said Mr. Jingle internally. And they entered the house. The scene of that afternoon was repeated that evening, and on the 3 afternoons and evenings next ensuing. On the fourth the host was in high spirits, for he had satisfied himself that there was no ground for the charge against Mr. Tupman. So was Mr. Tupman, for Mr. Jingle had told him that his affair would soon be brought to a crisis. So was Mr. Pickwick, for he was seldom otherwise. So was not Mr. Snodgrass, for he had grown jealous of Mr. Tupman. So was the old lady, for she had been winning at whist. So were Mr. Jingle and Miss Wardle, for reasons of sufficient importance in this eventful history to be narrated in another chapter. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9. A Discovery and a Chase.
The supper was ready laid, the chairs were drawn round the table, bottles, jugs, and glasses were arranged upon the sideboard, and everything betokened the approach of the most convivial period in the whole 24 hours. "Where's Rachel?" said Mr. Wardle. "Ay, and Jingle," added Mr. Pickwick. "Dear me," said the host, "I wonder I haven't missed him before. Why, I don't think I've heard his voice for 2 hours at least. Emily, my dear, ring the bell." The bell was rung, and the fat boy appeared. "Where's Miss Rachel?" He couldn't say. "Where's Mr. Jingle, then?" He didn't know. Everybody looked surprised. It was late, past 11 o'clock. Mr. Tupman laughed in his sleeve. They were loitering somewhere, talking about him. "Ha, ha, capital notion that, funny." "Never mind," said Wardle, after a short pause. "They'll turn up presently, I dare say. I never wait supper for anybody." "Excellent rule that," said Mr. Pickwick. "Admirable." "Pray sit down," said the host. "Certainly," said Mr. Pickwick, and down they sat. There was a gigantic round of cold beef on the table, and Mr. Pickwick was supplied with a plentiful portion of it. He had raised his fork to his lips, and was on the very point of opening his mouth for the reception of a piece of beef, when the hum of many voices suddenly arose in the kitchen. He paused and laid down his fork. Mr. Wardle paused too, and insensibly released his hold of the carving knife, which remained inserted in the beef. He looked at Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick looked at him. Heavy footsteps were heard in the passage. The parlour door was suddenly burst open, and the man who had cleaned Mr. Pickwick's boots on his first arrival rushed into the room, followed by the fat boy and all the domestics. "What the devil's the meaning of this?" exclaimed the host. "The kitchen chimney ain't afire, is it, Emma?" inquired the old lady. "Lor, Grandma, no!" screamed both the young ladies. "What's the matter?" roared the master of the house. The man gasped for breath, and faintly ejaculated, "They ha' gone, master, gone right clean off, sir." At this juncture Mr. Tupman was observed to lay down his knife and fork, and to turn very pale. "Who's gone?" said Mr. Wardle fiercely. "Musser Jingle and Miss Rachel in a po'chay from Blue Lion, Muggleton. I was there, but I couldn't stop 'em, so I run off to tell 'ee." "I paid his expenses," said Mr. Tupman, jumping up frantically. "He's got 10 pounds of mine. Stop him. He's swindled me. I won't bear it. I'll have justice, Pickwick. I won't stand it." And with sundry incoherent exclamations of the like nature, the unhappy gentleman spun round and round the apartment in a transport of frenzy. "Lord preserve us!" ejaculated Mr. Pickwick, eyeing the extraordinary gestures of his friend with terrified surprise. "He's gone mad! What shall we do?" "Do!" said the stout old host, who regarded only the last words of the sentence. "Put the horse in the gig. I'll get a chaise at the line and follow him instantly. Where?" he exclaimed as the man ran out to execute the commission. "Where's that villain Joe?" "Here I am, but I hain't a willin'," replied a voice. It was the fat boy's. "Let me get at him, Pickwick," cried Wardle as he rushed at the ill-starred youth. "He was bribed by that scoundrel Jingle to put me on a wrong scent by telling a cock and bull story of my sister and your friend Tupman." Here Mr. Tupman sank into a chair. "Let me get at him." "Don't let him!" screamed all the women, above whose exclamations the blubbering of the fat boy was distinctly audible. "I won't be held!" cried the old man. "Mr. Winkle, take your hands off! Mr. Pickwick, let me go, sir!" It was a beautiful sight, in that moment of turmoil and confusion, to behold the placid and philosophical expression of Mr. Pickwick's face, albeit somewhat flushed with exertion, as he stood with his arms firmly clasped round the extensive waist of their corpulent host, thus restraining the impetuosity of his passion, while the fat boy was scratched and pulled and pushed from the room by all the females congregated therein. He had no sooner released his hold than the man entered to announce that the gig was ready. "Don't let him go alone!" screamed the females. "He'll kill somebody!" "I'll go with him," said Mr. Pickwick. "You're a good fellow, Pickwick," said the host, grasping his hand. "Emma, give Mr. Pickwick a shawl to tie round his neck. Make haste. Look after your grandmother, girls. She has fainted away. Now then, are you ready?" Mr. Pickwick's mouth and chin having been hastily enveloped in a large shawl, his hat having been put on his head, and his great coat thrown over his arm, he replied in the affirmative. They jumped into the gig. "Give her head, Tom," cried the host, and away they went, down the narrow lanes, jolting in and out of the cart ruts and bumping up against the hedges on either side, as if they would go to pieces every moment. "How much are they ahead?" shouted Wardle as they drove up to the door of the Blue Lion, round which a little crowd had collected, late as it was. "Not above 3/4 of an hour," was everybody's reply. "Chase at 4 directly. Out with them. Put up the gig afterwards." "Now, boys," cried the landlord, "chase at 4 out. Make haste. Look alive there." Away ran the hostlers and the boys. The lanterns glimmered as the men ran to and fro, the horses' hoofs clattered on the uneven paving of the yard, the chaise rumbled as it was drawn out of the coach house, and all was noise and bustle. "Now then, is that chaise coming out to-night?" cried Wardle. "Coming down the yard now, sir," replied the hostler. Out came the chaise, in went the horses, on sprang the boys, in got the travellers. "Mind, the 7-mile stage in less than half an hour," shouted Wardle. "Off with you." The boys applied whip and spur, the waiters shouted, the hostlers cheered, and away they went, fast and furiously. "Pretty situation," thought Mr. Pickwick, when he had had a moment's time for reflection. "Pretty situation for the general chairman of the Pickwick Club. Damp chaise, strange horses, 15 miles an hour, and 12 o'clock at night." For the first 3 or 4 miles not a word was spoken by either of the gentlemen, each being too much immersed in his own reflections to address any observations to his companion. When they had gone over that much ground, however, and the horses, getting thoroughly warmed, began to do their work in really good style, Mr. Pickwick became too much exhilarated with the rapidity of the motion to remain any longer perfectly mute. "We're sure to catch them, I think," said he. "Hope so," replied his companion. "Fine night," said Mr. Pickwick, looking up at the moon, which was shining brightly. "So much the worse," returned Wardle, "for they'll have had all the advantage of the moonlight to get the start of us, and we shall lose it. It will have gone down in another hour." "It will be rather unpleasant going at this rate in the dark, won't it?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "I dare say it will," replied his friend dryly. Mr. Pickwick's temporary excitement began to sober down a little as he reflected upon the inconveniences and dangers of the expedition in which he had so thoughtlessly embarked. He was roused by a loud shouting of the postboy on the leader. "Yo, yo, 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 yo!" went the first boy. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" went the second. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" chimed in old Wardle himself, most lustily, with his head and half his body out of the coach window. "Yo, yo, yo, yo!" shouted Mr. Pickwick, taking up the burden of the cry, though he had not the slightest notion of its meaning or object. And amidst the yo-yoing of the whole four, the chaise stopped. "What's the matter?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "There's a gate here," replied old Wardle. "We shall hear something of the fugitives." After a lapse of 5 minutes, consumed in incessant knocking and shouting, an old man in his shirt and trousers emerged from the turnpike house and opened the gate. "How long is it since a post chaise went through here?" inquired Mr. Wardle. "How long? Ah! Why, I don't rightly know. It warn't a long time ago, nor it warn't a short time ago. Just between the two, perhaps." "Has any chaise been by at all?" "Oh, yes, there's been a shay by." "How long ago, my friend?" interposed Mr. Pickwick. "An hour?" "Ah, I dare say it might be," replied the man. "Or 2 hours?" inquired the post boy on the wheeler. "Well, I shouldn't wonder if it was," returned the old man doubtfully. "Drive on, boys," cried the testy old gentleman. "Don't waste any more time with that old idiot." "Idiot!" exclaimed the old man with a grin, as he stood in the middle of the road with the gate half closed, watching the chaise, which rapidly diminished in the increasing distance. "No, not much of that either. You've lost 10 minutes here and gone away as wise as you came arter all. If every man on the line as has a guinea give him earns it half as well, you won't catch t'other shay this side of Michaelmas, old short and fat." And with another prolonged grin the old man closed the gate, re-entered his house, and bolted the door after him. Meanwhile the chaise proceeded without any slackening of pace towards the conclusion of the stage. The moon, as Wardle had foretold, was rapidly on the wane. Large tiers of dark, heavy clouds, which had been gradually overspreading the sky for some time past, now formed one black mass overhead, and large drops of rain, which pattered every now and then against the windows of the chaise, seemed to warn the travellers of the rapid approach of a stormy night. The wind, too, which was directly against them, swept in furious gusts down the narrow road, and howled dismally through the trees which skirted the pathway. Mr. Pickwick drew his coat closer about him, coiled himself more snugly up into the corner of the chaise, and fell into a sound sleep, from which he was only awakened by the stopping of the vehicle, the sound of the hostler's bell, and a loud cry of "Horses on directly!" But here another delay occurred. The boys were sleeping with such mysterious soundness that it took 5 minutes apiece to wake them. The hostler had somehow or other mislaid the key of the stable, and even when that was found, 2 sleepy helpers put the wrong harness on the wrong horses, and the whole process of harnessing had to be gone through afresh. Had Mr. Pickwick been alone, these multiplied obstacles would have completely put an end to the pursuit at once. But old Wardle was not to be so easily daunted, and he laid about him with such hearty good will, cuffing this man and pushing that, strapping a buckle here and taking in a link there, that the chaise was ready in a much shorter time than could reasonably have been expected under so many difficulties. They resumed their journey, and certainly the prospect before them was by no means encouraging. The stage was 15 miles long. The night was dark, the wind high, and the rain pouring in torrents. It was impossible to make any great way against such obstacles united. It was hard upon 1 o'clock already, and nearly 2 hours were consumed in getting to the end of the stage. Here, however, an object presented itself which rekindled their hopes and reanimated their drooping spirits. "When did this chaise come in?" cried old Wardle, leaping out of his own vehicle, and pointing to one covered with wet mud, which was standing in the yard. "Not a quarter of an hour ago, sir," replied the hostler, to whom the question was addressed. "Lady and gentleman?" inquired Wardle, almost breathless with impatience. "Yes, sir." "Tall gentleman, dress coat, long legs, thin body?" "Yes, sir." "Elderly lady, thin face, rather skinny, eh?" "Yes, sir." "By heavens, it's the couple, Pickwick!" exclaimed the old gentleman. "Would have been here before," said the hostler, "but they broke a trace." "'Tis them," said Wardle, "it is, by Jove! Chaise and four instantly. We shall catch them yet before they reach the next stage. A guinea apiece, boys. Be alive there. Bustle about, there's good fellows." And with such admonitions as these, the old gentleman ran up and down the yard and bustled to and fro in a state of excitement which communicated itself to Mr. Pickwick also, and under the influence of which that gentleman got himself into complicated entanglements with harness, and mixed up with horses and wheels of chaises in the most surprising manner, firmly believing that by so doing he was materially forwarding the preparations for their resuming their journey. "Jump in! Jump in!" cried old Wardle, climbing into the chaise, pulling up the steps and slamming the door after him. "Come along, make haste!" And before Mr. Pickwick knew precisely what he was about, he felt himself forced in at the other door by one pull from the old gentleman and one push from the hostler, and off they were again. "Ah, we are moving now," said the old gentleman exultingly. They were indeed, as was sufficiently testified to Mr. Pickwick by his constant collision either with the hard woodwork of the chaise or the body of his companion. "Hold up!" said the stout old Mr. Wardle, as Mr. Pickwick dived head foremost into his capacious waistcoat. "I never did feel such a jolting in my life," said Mr. Pickwick. "Never mind," replied his companion. "It will soon be over. Steady, steady!" Mr. Pickwick planted himself into his own corner as firmly as he could, and on whirled the chaise faster than ever. They had travelled in this way about 3 miles, when Mr. Wardle, who had been looking out of the window for 2 or 3 minutes, suddenly drew in his face, covered with splashes, and exclaimed in breathless eagerness, "Here they are!" Mr. Pickwick thrust his head out of his window. Yes! There was a chaise and four, a short distance before them, dashing along at full gallop. Go on!" almost shrieked the old gentleman. "2 guineas apiece, boys. Don't let 'em gain on us. Keep it up, keep it up." The horses in the first chaise started on at their utmost speed, and those in Mr. Wardle's galloped furiously behind them. "I see his head!" exclaimed the choleric old man. "Damme, I see his head!" "So do I," said Mr. Pickwick. "That's he." Mr. Pickwick was not mistaken. The countenance of Mr. Jingle, completely coated with mud thrown up by the wheels, was plainly discernible at the window of his chaise, and the motion of his arm, which was waving violently towards the postilions, denoted that he was encouraging them to increased exertion. The interest was intense. Fields, trees, and hedges seemed to rush past them with the velocity of a whirlwind, so rapid was the pace at which they tore along. They were close by the side of the first chaise. Jingle's voice could be plainly heard, even above the din of the wheels, urging on the boys. Old Mr. Wardle foamed with rage and excitement. He roared out scoundrels and villains by the dozen, clenched his fist and shook it expressively at the object of his indignation. But Mr. Jingle only answered with a contemptuous smile, and replied to his menaces by a shout of triumph, as his horses, answering the increased application of whip and spur, broke into a faster gallop and left the pursuers behind. Mr. Pickwick had just drawn in his head, and Mr. Wardle, exhausted with shouting, had done the same, when a tremendous jolt threw them forward against the front of the vehicle. There was a sudden bump, a loud crash, away rolled a wheel, and over went the chaise. After a very few seconds of bewilderment and confusion, in which nothing but the plunging of horses and breaking of glass could be made out, Mr. Pickwick felt himself violently pulled out from among the ruins of the chaise, and as soon as he had gained his feet, extricated his head from the skirts of his greatcoat, which materially impeded the usefulness of his spectacles, the full disaster of the case met his view. Old Mr. Wardle, without a hat, and his clothes torn in several places, stood by his side, and the fragments of the chaise lay scattered at their feet. The postboys, who had succeeded in cutting the traces, were standing, disfigured with mud and disordered by hard riding, by the horses' heads. About 100 yards in advance was the other chaise, which had pulled up on hearing the crash. The postilions, each with a broad grin convulsing his countenance, were viewing the adverse party from their saddles, and Mr. Jingle was contemplating the wreck from the coach window with evident satisfaction. The day was just breaking, and the whole scene was rendered perfectly visible by the grey light of the morning. "Hullo!" shouted the shameless Jingle. "Anybody damaged? Elderly gentlemen? No light weights? Dangerous work, very." "You're a rascal!" roared Wardle. "Ha, ha!" replied Jingle, and then he added, with a knowing wink and a jerk of the thumb towards the interior of the chaise, "I say, she's very well. Desires her compliments. Begs you won't trouble yourself. Love to Tuppy. Won't you get up behind? Drive on, boys." The postilions resumed their proper attitudes, and away rattled the chaise, Mr. Jingle fluttering in derision a white handkerchief from the coach window. Nothing in the whole adventure, not even the upset, had disturbed the calm and equable current of Mr. Pickwick's temper. The villainy, however, which could first borrow money of his faithful follower, and then abbreviate his name to Tuppy, was more than he could patiently bear. He drew his breath hard, and coloured up to the very tips of his spectacles, as he said, slowly and emphatically, "If I ever meet that man again, I'll—" "Yes, yes," interrupted Wardle, "that's all very well, but while we stand talking here, they'll get their license and be married in London." Mr. Pickwick paused, bottled up his vengeance, and corked it down. "How far is it to the next stage?" inquired Mr. Wardle of one of the boys. 6 mile, ain't it, Tom?" "Rayther better. Rayther better nor 6 mile, sir." "Can't be helped," said Wardle. "We must walk it, Pickwick." "No help for it," replied that truly great man. So, sending forward one of the boys on horseback to procure a fresh chaise and horses, and leaving the other behind to take care of the broken one, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle set manfully forward on the walk, first tying their shawls round their necks, and slouching down their hats, to escape as much as possible from the deluge of rain which, after a slight cessation, had again begun to pour heavily down. Chapter 9.